Good afternoon, everybody. Happy Tuesday. I'm going to start this morning or this afternoon with a quote from my favorite author and in honor of Zora Neale Hurston during Women's History Month. Springtime in Florida is not a matter of people peeping violets or bursting buds merely. It is a riot of color and nature, glistening green leaves, pink, blue, purple, yellow blossoms that fairly stagger the visitor from the north. The miles of hyacinths are like an undulating carpet on the surface of the river and divide reluctantly when the slow-moving alligators push their way log-like across. The nights are white nights as the moon shines with dazzling splendor, or in the absence of that goddess, the soft darkness creeps down laden with innumerable scents. The heavy fragrance of magnolias mingled with the delicate sweetness of jasmine and wild roses. And that's from her story, Hitting a Straight Lick with a Crooked Stick, Stories from the Harlem Renaissance. Happy spring, everybody. The good news, Congress has passed a $1.9 trillion relief bill. The Paycheck Protection Plan has been extended. Checks are in the mail, and we're all getting vaccinated. I even heard someone say the pandemic must be over, but they weren't talking about the impact of the relief bill, or even that Stanley Tucci is traveling all across Italy eating gourmet pizza and we get to watch. Their rationale was that we have returned to public mass killings. Though 2020 saw plenty of killing with more on-edge armed citizens, in 2 weeks there have been 2 mass shootings that have left 18 people dead. House lawmakers of the 117th Congress have passed 2 bills aimed at strengthening the nation's gun laws, including a bill that would require background checks on all guns and firearms and transfers. Next week is the start of the trial of Derek Chauvin for the murder of George Floyd. And he's being charged for second-degree unintentional murder, third-degree murder, and second-degree manslaughter for holding his knee pressed to a man's neck until he died, which we all witnessed in plain daylight. And he has pled not guilty. House lawmakers have approved the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act, H.R. 1280, a massive overhaul of American policing that would make it much easier to sue rogue officers. A nationwide chokehold ban is gaining traction. Yes, elections have consequences, and policy matters, and every voice must be heard, and every vote must be counted. However, the fight over who can vote and how, often cast as voting integrity, has galvanized a significant number of elected officials to pursue voting restrictions as the way to determine whose voices should be heard. For some in power, voting restrictions are now viewed as a political life or death debate, and the fight over who has the right to vote has all but eclipsed traditional controversial issues like abortion, gun rights, immigration, healthcare, and tax cuts. More than 250 bills have been introduced in 43 states that would limit mail voting, cut hours that polling places are open, and impose restrictions that target voters of color and young voters. In 2013, in a 5-4 decision, the Supreme Court eroded key parts of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which protected voters from racial discrimination and intimidation. The John R. Lewis Voting Rights Act will restore the Voting Rights Act, and the For the People Act is the solution to protect them. ASBC's Race and Equity Working Group was created to address the inequities prevalent and pervasive in the economic and social construct of the United States, and to hold our legislators accountable to social and economic justice. We ensure that the dignity and respect of diverse perspectives, voices, and values of a multicultural America are heard and reflected in ASBC's policy work toward creating an equitable and compassionate economy for all. We are delighted today that Allison Hunn is here to talk to us about our voting rights and the For the People Act, a vital piece of legislation led by Senator Jeff Merkley of Oregon that we all need to be paying attention to. And if you have questions for Allison during her talk, I would ask that you please put them in the Q&A box. And then at the end, I'll share them with everyone and allow Allison the opportunity to answer those questions directly. A little bit about Allison. She's the Policy Advisor and Counsel for Senator Merkley, focusing on the economy and democracy reform. And prior to joining the Hill, she worked in El Paso, Texas as a National Policy Chief of Staff for Beto O'Rourke's presidential bid. He did really well. I'm so proud of him. Good job. Allison previously served as a legal policy analyst for the litigation nonprofit Democracy Forward, and then in the Obama administration's White House Office of Cabinet Affairs. However, Allison is a creature of presidential campaigns. Before her time at the White House, she worked on President Obama's 2012 re-election campaign in Chicago and spent a law school semester in Brooklyn for Hillary Clinton. Allison received her JD from University of California, Berkeley School of Law, and holds a BA from the University of Virginia, where she graduated Phi Beta Kappa and a member of the Raven Society. Welcome, Allison. Thank you for joining us. I'm turning it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Marianne, for that beautiful introduction. I am thrilled to be talking to you all today. The timing couldn't be better. We introduced the For the People Act in the Senate last week after House passage, and we are anticipating tomorrow's hearing in front of the Rules Committee. This is very exciting because it will be the first Senate hearing on the For the People Act. So encourage anyone who's interested to tune in tomorrow at 10 a.m. Where it will be live streamed from Rules. So it should be a very interesting hearing. It's a very interesting committee. It's the only committee in which Senators Schumer and McConnell are members. So it will certainly be one to watch, and encourage everyone to tune in. As Marianne mentioned, I'm more than happy to take questions at the end of this talk. I will certainly answer them to the best of my ability. As you all likely know, this is an 800-page piece of legislation. It is very comprehensive. So I will do my utmost. And if there is anything that I can't answer today, I'm happy to leave my email with Thomas or others, and we can follow up and make sure that you all have the answers that you need, because this is, as Marianne said, such an important piece of legislation. The bill is really divided into three pieces, and this is an oversimplification. The first, Division A, is what we call our voting piece. The second is campaign finance, and then the third is ethics reform. So I'm happy to kind of start with that overview and dive in a little bit. When it comes to voting, there's, a big piece is improving the voting process. And so that is improvements to voting registration. That includes requiring states to implement automatic voter registration and to allow individuals to register online. There's voting accessibility, where we're expanding access to vote by mail, where you're expanding at least 15 days of early voting before the election, requiring states to provide drop boxes so there's alternatives to how you can return your ballot. There's also a voting rights component, and a big function of that is looking at gerrymandering and requiring state-level independent redistricting commissions to improve that process. Another piece is election security, and that goes to, there's authorizations for grants that will allow states to upgrade their election infrastructure. When it comes to campaign finance, there's a few different pieces. First and foremost, and thank you, that section by section is really helpful. When it comes to campaign finance, I think there's three big pieces. The first is disclosure, which is requiring that super PACs and issue advocacy groups disclose donors who contribute over $10,000. And so that is really an effort to shine a light on where this money is coming and where it's flowing. There's a small donor matching system, which creates a publicly financed system on small dollar donations to help finance campaigns. There's a version in the House, there's a version in the Senate bill. And it's really important to note that this public financing system is not derived from taxpayer dollars. It's really unique in that it would be financed entirely through a surcharge on corporate malfeasance. So it would be, an assessment on fines and fees rather than taking money out of the tax base, because as Marianne also mentioned, there's just so many other priorities that the Senate and Congress is balancing, and money needs to go to a lot of different places. We're talking about an infrastructure bill, there's a lot going on. And the third would be just improvements to campaign finance administration. So that includes, modifications to the FEC, things like that. The last piece, and again, I know I'm going rather quickly, happy to answer any questions, and the section by section is certainly a good place to look. But the ethics standards improvement goes to strengthening lobbying disclosures, improvements to executive branch ethics. So that's requiring the president and vice president to divest financial interests that pose a conflict, requiring candidates to disclose their tax returns, strengthening conflict of interest laws. And then also there's ethics reform for the courts and members of Congress. And so that ensures, that members of Congress are not using taxpayer funds to settle employment discrimination cases, and requiring a code of ethics to be created for the Supreme Court. As you all likely know, there's already codes of ethics that apply to other judges. There should be one for the Supreme Court as well. So that's really a top level overview. I'll note that the House bill and the Senate bill are very, very close. We've been working night and day with our counterparts on the House to ensure that the legislation is very tight. In the Senate, we've had to make a few edits. Some of it comes through just the language that senators have been using for similar provisions in the House. So there might be slight language discrepancies. We've been working with state elected officials to ensure that administrability is possible, and so have made a few small reforms there. Since the bill passed the House, we've also incorporated what was the House manager's amendment, that big package of amendments that came through before final passage. So much of that, if it wasn't already in the Senate version, has been incorporated to keep it tighter. But there will be continued efforts to, make the bill as good as possible. And we anticipate Rules Committee to do a markup of the legislation in April. We'll be after this week, we'll be heading out for a 2-week recess around Easter for members to go back to their home states. But when we return, we'll have the month of April to be working on this bill in full. So, after that, I couldn't speak to at this moment timing on the floor. There's going to be a number of other priorities that the Senate is working through, but I will just say there's a lot of support and enthusiasm for this bill. There were 49 co-sponsors when we introduced, and are just very excited to hear from you all and to work on this. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you. So I have a question. So is this going to be a purely partisan, approval? Do you think, is there any reason to believe that we're going to get any support from, that it'll be bipartisan?
I couldn't say so many. It's worth noting that so many of the reforms that are included in the bill are bipartisan or nonpartisan in nature, or have already been implemented in a number of states. CREW, I don't know if you all are familiar with them, has put out a really helpful report on sort of the history of these reforms and their bipartisan origins. I'd really encourage folks to check that out. I think the idea behind this bill is to expand the electorate, to provide greater protections, to put power back in the hands of the people. And that is not a partisan position. And so I think we're certainly not closing the door to bipartisan collaboration. We don't currently have any Republicans co-sponsoring the bill, but I don't want to say that, that's not a possibility.
So the 250 plus bills that are floating around, will this eliminate that? Or, so what does that mean for all of those
Sure.
attempts? Yeah.
No, it's a fantastic question. And actually the Brennan Center recently put out a chart that is really helpful, that shows, where these different bills fall, because so many of them are thematic. It's, increasing voter purges, limiting the ability to vote by mail, really restricting access in that way. And there's just so many states. I think if I'm remembering the numbers right, I think 14 states currently have legislation that would limit the ability of an individual to vote by mail, and this bill expands it. So I'm happy to, I'll send it to Thomas after, but it's a really helpful chart that kind of goes through it and groups it, because you're exactly right. And in Iowa, for example, the legislation that was recently signed into law by Governor Reynolds, Governor Kim Reynolds, limits the number of early voting days and, cuts poll hours. And so, you look at the different provisions in this bill, which creates a minimum number of early voting days and, offers alternatives to individuals returning their ballot. And so there's ways that they might also be counteracting some of the other legislation that's out there.
Okay, thank you. Well, that's a little bit reassuring, I guess. I know that I live in Tennessee, and I know that it's a fight. You know what I'm saying? So, and I know that Georgia has been specifically targeted. So, a little concern there. So, thank you. I'm going to definitely take a look at that. And we have a question from Mike Lapham. He's following up on my question about are there Democrats in the Senate or House who are problematic on H.R. 1, the Manchin types?
I don't know that I would say that any members are problematic. I think, every member is representing their constituency, and part of the exercise in this bill is making sure that we're addressing all concerns to get as much robust support as we can. So there is, the bill passed the House with 220 votes. It was a robust passage, and I think we're seeing robust support in the Senate. So I wouldn't want to call out any members, specifically. I think we're just trying to get as much support as we can because it's too important not to.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Hi, Mike. Good to see you. Let's see, are there any more questions? Thomas, you have a question.
Yeah, as you're going through it, Mary Ann, just to a couple things, Allison, I may have missed this. My understanding is that that if passed, if For the People becomes law, as we all hope it does, it would not impact state regulations on voting. Is that correct? So that this would only impact federal, so people voting for Congress, people voting for the US Senate, people voting for president. But if you're voting gubernatorial race, it would not be impacted. Is that right?
Right. So Congress has the authority to set uniform standards around federal elections. I think in off years, there is an argument to be made that states would perhaps implement different procedures. But I think the general feeling is that this legislation is creating sort of a floor for how elections will be run. And so, if states are going to make modifications in off years when there aren't federal elections, like that's certainly within the realm. But there is a question of, does that make the most sense when you're, implementing these different election processes? So it is an outstanding question. But yes, this applies to federal elections because that's the constitutional authority that.
One might also ask, what did two water fountains make sense, in the Jim Crow era? And I think the obvious answer is no. But let me ask another question. How does this, and I know this has not come to the Senate yet. At least my understanding is that it has not. But how does this fit in with the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act?
Absolutely. So these are two separate pieces of legislation. We view them as, certainly a package of democracy reform, but it is important that they're also moving alone because of the, various equities that come with creating this legislation. So you're right. The John Lewis Voting Rights Bill has not been reintroduced in this Congress yet. And so they are moving on two separate tracks, but I think they are certainly in partnership in that, there is a question about how do we restore voting rights and pre-clearance if possible when it comes to responding to Shelby. But this takes a different track. This is not looking at that litigation per se and is increasing other democracy standards.
And let me follow up on that because that was a really good question, Thomas. So when I was reading through both of them, what it seemed to be was that the John Lewis Voting Rights Act is to restore what the Supreme Court undid, and then For the People Act is for expanding, voting rights,
Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
Right. So,
Enfranchisement broadly, I think that's a really great way to put it. Mhm.
okay. I got another question. This is from Mike again. I'm curious about the interplay between HR 1 and other legal challenges to nefarious voting changes. Does passage of HR 1 then help with legal challenges to voting regulations?
I'm not entirely sure if I'm following the question. I think the hope would be the passage of HR 1 would be setting new standards so that groups who are having to respond to some of these voter suppression tactics through litigation would not be forced to rely on that. You wouldn't be taking a state to court over moving polling locations or, restricting access to the ballot, things like that, because it would already be a standard in the legislation. So I hope I'm answering that correctly. I think really what we're looking at is a new standard so that you're not forced to rely on litigation to expand voting rights. I think another question is if this is a new statute that then could be used for enforcement that might need to come through litigation. That's very possible, but I think that's the goal is to really make sure that we're just covering our bases here.
And Mike says that's what he meant. So thank you. And then I have a question from Daniel. He says, I believe strong ethical processes are the best way to increase faith in the government. So I'm particularly interested in the parts of the bill that help expand the reach and power of the Office of Government Ethics. I guess that's a comment.
Great.
Oh, wait.
Great.
Wait,
Okay.
there's more. Disclosure, my company is a major OGE contractor, though OGE only represents about 8% of our revenue. That said, OGE is a super important organization to improve faith in government, and I'm glad it's getting some more power. Is there any effort to give it power over ethics of government contractors?
That's a good question. I wouldn't be able to answer offhand. I will say that the bill reauthorizes the Office of Government Ethics. I think we certainly agree that it is an important piece of enforcement in the government. And there's also language that would enhance its ability to enforce ethics. But I would need to go back and double check, and I can follow up with Thomas after this to get you an answer.
Okay, I don't know if it's a question, I have a comment. So it feels like the vote and election reform has got to be the most important agenda item over everything else, because it all matters who is in charge, who's the federal government, who's listening. I'm sure the administration gets that, and we're close to getting it. Well, hopefully, as Thomas said, we're getting it all passed and down the line, because it just seems that without this, then where are we? You know what I'm saying? If this does not pass, is there a plan B? Now, hopefully it will, but is there a plan B?
I think right now this is the sole focus. We have, as Senator Schumer has said, failure is not an option here. This is really something that we have to get done. To your point, we see all these other policies that stem from the ability of individuals to elect leaders that they want to represent them. I mean, we need comprehensive legislation to address climate chaos after the tragedies we saw last night. And in Atlanta, there's a question about needing leaders that will enact gun reform. I mean, there's so many policies that stem from these elections, and elections matter. And so I think, Marianne, you're spot on that this has to be, and it is. I mean, Senator Schumer designated this legislation as S1 to indicate the priority that it holds for the caucus and for the country. And the bill's been HR1 now for 2 years in the House. And it's been moving rather quickly. So I think there's a lot of momentum, coming out of what we saw in Georgia, both with the voter suppression bills, but how the elections were conducted. There's a lot of enthusiasm and momentum and much to be done. And I think we need to capitalize on this moment. So
Go ahead.
Well, so what can business leaders do? How can we support this?
It's such a great question. I think there's two things. I mean, the first is you all represent such diverse groups from diverse areas. Getting in touch with your elected official. If they're on the bill, great. Call them and let them know that you still support it, that you need that we need the momentum to keep going. If they're not on the bill, call and, see why, encourage their support. I think there's a lot to be done, and we are going to have to keep the drumbeat up, particularly as we're going into a recess. We'll come back for markup, but there just needs to be a reinforcement of the support from so many different communities, and I think hearing your voices will go a long way for a lot of elected officials. So
we will certainly encourage our membership. Allison, we'll be working on an e-blast and a sign-on to send to offices, and we'll also talk about making phone calls as well. Let me ask a slightly different question, if I may. There's obviously been a lot of focus on what others have termed the big lie about the 2020 election results and their legitimacy. I think most rational people understand that it was absolutely a legitimate election. Even Republican elected officials in the various states, including Georgia's Secretary of State, and the guy who was in charge of cybersecurity for the election system, a Republican appointed by then President Trump, all said, that this was the most secure election. There are a number of provisions in this bill about the security of elections, and I wondered if you might talk about that too, because obviously there's a large swath of the American public who've now been persuaded, or whatever verb you want to use, that somehow our elections aren't secure, and I just wonder how those two issues, what's in the bill versus that perception.
Sure. So, I think that's absolutely right that, part of what needs to be done is restore faith in our government, and that can come through election security, but that can also come through increased transparency and, faith in who you're electing. I think it's important to note that there is, in addition to the election security, there are provisions that also strengthen involvement of foreign nationals in the democratic process. So there's prohibitions on campaign spending by foreign nationals. There's a duty to report when it comes to foreign election interference. And so I think those pieces are important to note because of, the lessons learned from past elections. When it comes to election security, there's a requirement for voter verifiable paper ballots for voting. There's, ensuring that all voters have the opportunity to complete a hand-marked ballot. There's of the $2 billion I mentioned in grants to states to upgrade their election systems, there's 20 million of that goes to risk limiting post-election audits. So there can be sort of a look back on what happened. And then there's also just a broader grant for election infrastructure innovation grants. I'll also note that there is a provision on ensuring that voting machines are domestically owned and assembled. I think that's another piece that folks are interested in. And so I'm certainly not doing all of it justice, but there has been a certain attention to election security, certainly.
And if I may, let me ask one other provision. Can you talk a little bit? And I think it would be of particular interest to this group. Can you talk a little bit, because of the disproportionate incarceration? Can you talk about the provisions relative to restoration of voting rights? How that works. And I noticed there's a provision in there about gerrymandering, and I'm curious. I did not know about this, but I'm curious about. Maybe you could enlighten me, at least.
Sure thing. So when it comes to, I just want to make sure I have my notes up in the right place. When it comes to the democracy restoration for felons, so that is actually a separate piece of legislation that has been championed in the Senate by Senator Cardin, and it really restores the rights of citizens to vote in federal elections and requires states to notify individuals of their reenfranchisement, because I think, certainly as seen in Florida, there's still been a lot of confusion over, how this restoration is taking place. When it comes to the gerrymandering provision, I will say that I'm not quite as fluent on the various pieces of the independent redistricting committees, but if you'll bear with me for 1 minute, I just want to pull up my notes real quick. So sorry, hold on.
No, it's okay. I didn't mean to get that drag you that far into the weeds, but
Oh no, it's okay. Well, so then, yeah, I think it's just certainly worth noting that the legislation calls for the involvement of an independent redistricting committee, taking the authority out of state elected officials in making these determinations. So I think that there's a
so this would be independent commissions doing congressional redistricting. Is that?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, that would, I would think that would certainly help sort of restore some balance. When you have partisan politicians drawing their own districts and obviously making them, we have so few districts that are truly competitive these days that it reinforces the extremes in both parties, unfortunately.
And, I'll say there's been a lot of attention paid to apportionment and redistricting this year. Certainly, we're still paying attention to when census is going to even be able to share that information with states. So it's certainly something that remains top of mind. But this is, where the legislation is currently.
And so, Allison, so what's the timeline for the bill's passage now?
I couldn't give you a firm timeline. The next determinate window is when we'll see markup in the Rules Committee, and then I think we'll just see what's possible from there.
Okay, so is it within a matter of months?
I couldn't put a firm date on it. I think we are working diligently to ensure that it happens with urgency. But I don't want to say one way or the other.
I'm just thinking of the 2022 midterms.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so are we. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Right.
So
got to get that done. Right.
Yeah. Absolutely.
I noticed, Marianne, I think Mike had one more question.
Oh, is there resistance to particular aspects of this from either side? And what support and would support for those specific aspects or components of the bill from business owners and others help?
That's a great question. I think one area that there's been resistance to is this concept of the public financed elections. And I think a reinforcement of the fact that I don't think it's always appreciated that taxpayer dollars are not used to finance these elections, or is it made totally clear that it still remains an opt-in system? So if a member felt that they, if it was better for them to not be, or a candidate, felt it was better to not be participating in the publicly financed election, they could still do that. I think that's been a real point of discussion that we're hearing a lot about. I mean, we've been hearing a lot of different rhetoric. Former President Trump came out last week and said, or CPAC, I guess, was a couple weeks ago, saying the bill was a disaster, couldn't be passed. And so you hear some of that rhetoric, but I don't think that there's been particularly hot spots to provisions. I think there's misinformation, and I think some of that is tied to the small dollar financing. So to the extent that is already in place in your state or otherwise, would welcome the support there.
And then, yeah, I'm a communications specialist. That's what I do. And so one of the things that I notice, and this is, from a person who just consumes the news, pays attention, a business activist leader kind of person, so I care about this stuff, is, and was true of, and maybe it's just true of Democrats, but it was definitely true through the Obama administration, is the effectiveness of communicating the positive aspects of the bill. In other words, selling it, right? I don't, I'm not, are we doing a good enough job of that? Can we work a little harder at that? This is me saying, I don't hear enough coverage of the good components of the bill, or why, to get people excited, or to dispel the myths about, what is not working or supposedly not working about the voting system. So I'm just wanting to tell your communications people that they need to do a better job of that.
Okay, yeah, that's helpful feedback. I think, there's so much in the bill. It is certainly hard to message everything comprehensively. And so I think that's a really, folks pick up on different pieces if their interest is more voting access. But we also certainly need messengers on the ground as well. And so that's where groups like yours, to the extent that, you're willing to lift this up and let members know that you support it, or, push it out in your other communications, we're so grateful. And so the sign-on letter, the letters of support and endorsement also go a long way in our efforts as we're continuing to generate support.
Allison, let me add to that. When it obviously tomorrow the rules hearing is a different animal, but when it comes to down the road, if there are witnesses or testimony that can be helpful from our business members in support, please let us know. We'd be happy to help organize that as well.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. That's very generous.
Yeah, a town hall. I want to see a town hall on this.
Okay.
It's a big deal.
It is.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I saw a stat. It's the most comprehensive piece of voting legislation since 1965, since the Voting Rights Act. So we have an obligation to get this done.
Yeah, and it is such a voluminous bill that breaking it down, even if it were like, just discussions on each piece of it, something. So if you need help with that, call me. I really want to make sure that everybody, is not only more than aware, vested in this, because it's so ridiculously critical. We saw what happened, in 2010, when people, everybody relaxed and just thought, oh, we voted Obama in, we'll just sit back and with our popcorn and watch him work, and not understanding that we have to stay in the game and it matters every single vote, so that message, I'm really want to make sure that it's pounded from on high,
I think that's a great point. And, I think it's also the point that it's unfair of us to burden individuals to participate in the democratic process, to ask someone to wait in line for 6-7 hours, if not longer. This bill caps wait times at 30 minutes, and that, someone shouldn't lose their whole day or have to take a day off work, or, forego their salary for that day to participate. And so, there's, we have to keep the enthusiasm up. We have to keep up the drumbeat, but we also have to think about the impact that this is going to have on just all Americans to have their voice heard and advance the priorities that we know we need to move this country forward. So I certainly agree.
And there was your soundbite, that a capped waiting time of 30 minutes.
Yeah. There's so much in this bill. It's just, there's a lot to be lifted up, certainly.
Okay. All right. Do we have any other questions? I don't think so. Thomas?
I just, I'll just say that, the only thing, and you don't need me to tell you that, it always seems like it's the same folks in the same locations who are standing in line for hours and hours. And that's not an accident. But I'll just say, Allison, we're looking forward to, ASBC is looking forward to supporting this in the Senate, and doing whatever we can to support your efforts to get this passed and have it signed into law.
Well, thank you all so much for the opportunity to talk about this today and your questions. And I'm happy to follow up with more if you're thinking about it and want to shoot me anything. Please let me know. We really are so grateful for your support and your interest, and looking forward to working with you.
And thank you to your senator. We really
Thank you.
appreciate, him leading on this, and yeah, count on us. We'll help wherever we can.
Great.
I'm gonna go through it with a highlight and find your sound bites.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Okay, well, on that note, I hope that everybody has a wonderful rest of the afternoon, and we'll see you again in about a month. Thank you, Allison. Enjoy your day.
Thank you all so much. Have a good
Thanks, everybody.
All right, bye-bye.